Welcome back to In the Word. We are in Ezekiel chapters 42 through 45. So, getting close to finishing another book of the Old Testament. So, good for you, and press on with this reading. I trust that the Lord is encouraging you by His Spirit, as well as edifying and educating you as we go through this. These chapters are part of the last section in Ezekiel that talks about the restoration of Israel from chapters 40 to 48. It has three sections. Its first section is about the new temple in chapters 40 to 43, and then new worship in 44 to 46, and then new land in 47 and 48. So today we're in this section just finishing the new temple and entering a section on the new worship as we go through chapters again, 42 through 45. I've labeled chapter 42 the rooms of the inner court. So the first 12 verses or so are talking about the dimensions of the rooms in the inner court, and then 13 through the end of the chapter discussing the size of the outer wall. When you get down to verses 15 and following, you'll see there are 500 cubits all around. That's about 878 feet. So we're talking about a very large structure here. If you take all the dimensions, you can fit 13 American football fields inside of this structure. It's going to be massive. Again, some have criticized this and said it can't be literal because the dimensions are just too large for the Temple Mount. We'll see some other dimensions about the land later. But remember that in Isaiah chapter 2 and Ezekiel, not Ezekiel, but Zephaniah, Zedekiah, chapter 14, talks about topographic changes that will happen to Jerusalem when Jesus returns. So I think that there's a good reason to understand this as literal. Chapter 43 then, in terms of continuing with the restoration of the temple, we see the most important part now, the Lord's glory, His visible presence, His Shekinah glory returning to the temple in chapter 43. The Lord's glory had progressively departed. Ezekiel had seen that and told of his vision. Now he sees a vision of the Lord returning. The departure of the Lord's glory was in chapter 10, verses 18 and 19, in chapter 11, verses 22 and 23. But here we see in the verse 9 verses the return of the Lord's glory coming to the temple. And then in verses 10 through 12 is the message to Israel. And the essence of the message here is holiness. I know that in this section of Ezekiel, there's a lot of detail. I call it mind-numbing detail. It gets very repetitious. I think the main thing that you should take away as you skim through this section is God's demand, I would say not only desire, but demand for holiness in worship and where He will dwell among His people. He wants us to be perfect people, and He is going to have a perfect sanctuary, and that sanctuary is going to be completely set apart for Him, as will the people be completely set apart for Him. So note that, and note how the Lord desires, even now, in the age of the church, that we be set apart to Him, that we set our hearts, our minds, emotion, and will on Him and serve Him in everything we do. He wants a holy people for a holy God. Starting in chapter 43, verse 13, then we see the dimensions of the altar. Again, very large, not unlike the size of Solomon's altar, so returning it to the glory of Solomon's temple. Altar will be, if you look up those dimensions, about 19 feet tall. Part of it is below ground level. but about 15 feet will extend above ground level of that altar. Then verses 18 through the end of the chapter are talking about the dedication of the altar, setting it apart. Again, note the recurrent theme of holiness here, being set apart for the Lord. And as a result of that, when we get to the end of the chapter, it says that God will be with them. This is the full fellowship with the Lord will be reestablished at this point. What was always longed for, what was always desired by Israel and promised by God to be among his people, he will have that full fellowship with them at this point by the end of chapter 43. Moving in chapter 44 then, we look at no longer the temple, but we move to this new section about the worship, looking at my notes here, and the new worship will be described from chapters 44 through 46. So the first question that's answered, and the way I labeled or titled chapter 44 is who may serve. And we see first of all the negative prohibition, not foreigners. Foreigners will not be allowed. They've led Israel astray over and over. With ungodly leaders. We'll see the Levites are judged as well in a moment here. But no foreigners will serve in this temple. Notice also in these opening verses that Ezekiel is looking at the east gate, and this east gate is shut. And it's shut appears to be permanently. The God of Israel has entered by it. It says at the end of verse 42 that God's entry, his Shekinah glory coming through that east gate has so made it holy, has so set it apart that no one will use that gate again. It shall remain shut. And it says in verse 3, only the prince may sit in it to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by way of the vestibule of the gate and shall go out by the same way. So only the prince. Who is this prince? Well, if you go back to chapter 34 and 37, you'll find this prince is King David. This is resurrected King David, has a significant role to play in this millennial kingdom. Specifically, chapter 34, verse 24, and chapter 37, verses 24 and 25. You can find David identified as the prince. Then in verse 9, we see beginning the discussion about the Levites. The Levites, by God's grace, are going to continue to serve. They were instrumental in leading Israel astray in the past. They brought unholy sacrifices before the Lord. They were unrighteous and unholy and introduced idolatry into the temple itself. So the Levites have a purpose. They have a role to play in the new temple and the new worship, but it's more limited. They've been judged in verses 9 through 14. And then we see the sons of Zadok will take a leadership role. They'll be the ministers. I look at the Levites as being servants, the sons of Zadok being ministers. Zadok was one family within the line of the Levites. They were particularly faithful to the Lord, so they're being rewarded for that here. We find the account of their faithfulness and their service under Solomon in 1 Kings 1, 32 through 35, and 1 Kings 2, 26 and 27. You can see more details about them. You've read through that section before. You probably remember the name Zadok. And they will serve, and they'll have role as not only a ministering priest, but in verse 23, they'll be teaching the people. So they'll have a teaching role, giving them discernment, giving them understanding of what the Lord desires. There'll be judges in verse 24, deciding disputes for the Lord. And they'll be taken care of specifically by the Lord, that is their physical needs in verse 28. Chapter 45, which closes out our reading today, make sure I'm not going to go over my 15 minutes. I try to hit 15 minutes every day. Describes how they're going to be supported. That is, how the ministers of the temple are going to be supported. And again, I love the care of God, the practicality. Those who serve in the temple, those who serve the Lord will be taken care of materially. It'll open up into Romans chapter 15, I think, where a new kind of principle of New Testament giving is you give you give materially where you are blessed spiritually. So that's we see that here in the Old Testament in seed form and fully developed when we get into the New Testament. So how are they supported in chapter 45? And what essentially happens here in the first 6 verses is God sets apart a land roughly 8 miles by 6 miles that's centered around the temple. Half of that land goes to the Levites, half of it goes to the Zadokites. The Zadokites, Zadok, his family, are closer to the temple. The Levites are a little further out. And then we have the prince, David. He's also, in verses 7 and 8, allocated land around Jerusalem. So outside this area, he is allocated land that basically goes from the boundary of the temple to the Jordan River on the one side and to the Mediterranean on the other. And then verses 9 and 12, 9 to 12 are kind of an aside. Ezekiel is now addressing the current leaders who have been cheating the people, who have been swindling them for their own gain, and using the people as to enrich themselves. And he addresses them in those verses 9 through 12, exhorting them in light of what's coming to treat the people fairly. And certainly as we read prophecy, as we understand what's coming, should change the way we live, should change our attitudes, should change how we feel about things, should change how we act. Our mind, emotion, and will, under the authority and power and the illumination of the Holy Spirit, gives us different standards to live by. Not standards of today, trying to enrich ourselves, not trying to add to our own authority and power, but knowing that the Lord's going to come back, the Lord's going to reign and rule. That should change our lives, and I think that's the idea here in verses 9 through 12, that Ezekiel is telling these princes, look guys, repent, the Lord's coming, he's going to restore this, and all that you're doing is going to be exposed for what it is. Verse 13 then, through the end of the chapter and on into chapter 46, begins to describe the worship or the sacrifices that are going to be offered there. Again, if you're confused about, okay, why would we be having sacrifices in the millennial temple, in the end times, in the presence of Christ, I'd refer you to my presentation from Saturday, a discussion on Saturday about Ezekiel's temple, and I provide some theories there about what's going on with these sacrifices. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, for continuing in Ezekiel. By the end of the week, we'll be moving into the book of Daniel on Thursday. An exciting book, a book where I think the Lord kind of pulls back the curtain and lets us see the spiritual realities that are happening behind the world that we live in. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and may God illuminate your soul by His Spirit and move your mind, emotion, and will to live more and more in accordance with what He's going to do and what He's done. God bless you.